Margaret's heart and sent Charles Henley running to fetch Thomas from the grounds. There, arranged with almost ceremonial precision on the imported Persian rug, lay Evangeline's emerald gown. The fabric was still warm when Margaret touched it, as if Evangeline had only just removed it, and the scent of her signature lavender perfume hung in the cold morning air, like the ghost of her presence. The gown appeared to have been removed with great care, lying flat and perfectly arranged as if it were being displayed for viewing. No buttons were torn, no seams were damaged, and the delicate beadwork remained intact. Beside the gown lay a single piece of paper, a page torn from Evangeline's private journal, with only 4 words written in her distinctive handwriting: "The truth must survive." But there were other, more disturbing details that the servants noticed in those first terrifying moments of discovery. The Persian rug beneath the gown showed slight discoloration, as if it had been recently cleaned or treated with some kind of chemical solution. The air in the foyer carried not just the scent of lavender perfume, but also a faint odor that Thomas later described as medicinal, like the stuff they use in hospitals to put people to sleep. Most puzzling of all was the condition of Evangeline's jewelry. Her wedding ring, a massive diamond surrounded by emeralds that was worth more than most people's homes, lay on the marble floor beside the gown. But the small silver locket that Margaret had noticed the night before was nowhere to be found. It was as if whoever had removed Evangeline's gown had specifically taken that one piece of jewelry while leaving behind items of far greater monetary value. When Cornelius was awakened and brought downstairs, his reaction puzzled and disturbed the servants. Rather than the panic or desperation one might expect from a husband discovering his wife missing, he stood in the foyer for several long minutes, staring at the gown with an expression that Margaret later described as more fearful than surprised, as if he'd been expecting something terrible to happen. His face had gone pale, but it was the pallor of a man confronting a long-anticipated crisis rather than the shock of an unexpected tragedy. Even more strange was Cornelius's immediate reaction to the situation. Instead of demanding that the servant search the house or calling for the police, his first action was to send Charles Henley to fetch his private secretary, a nervous man named Arthur Pemberton, who handled Cornelius's most sensitive business correspondence. His second action was to order Margaret to gather all of Evangeline's personal papers and journals from her study, ostensibly to help in the search for clues about her disappearance, but in a manner that seemed more concerned with controlling evidence than finding his missing wife. Dr. Franklin Westbrook arrived at the mansion within an hour of being summoned, but by then, Cornelius had already taken control of the situation in a way that seemed almost rehearsed. The doctor was not asked to examine the scene or offer medical opinions about possible explanations for Evangeline's disappearance. Instead, he was ushered into Cornelius's private office for a conversation that lasted nearly 30 minutes and from which he emerged looking deeply troubled and refusing to speak to anyone else about what had been discussed. The most chilling detail of all was discovered by Thomas Brennan during his careful examination of the mansion's exterior. While the snow around the house showed no signs of footprints, he found something far more disturbing near the entrance to the old ice house. There, partially hidden beneath a thin layer of fresh snow, were dark stains on the ground that looked suspiciously like blood. When Thomas attempted to investigate further, he was ordered away from the area by Cornelius himself, who claimed that the ice house was structurally unsafe and off-limits to all household staff. The official investigation into Evangeline Vandermark's disappearance lasted exactly 6 days, a remarkably brief period for a case involving one of Pittsburgh's most prominent families. Detective Samuel Crawford, a 20-year veteran of the Pittsburgh Police Department, was assigned to the case, but found his efforts hampered at every turn by what he would later describe in his private notes as interference from parties unknown. Crawford was an honest cop, in a city where honesty was often a luxury that law enforcement couldn't afford, and his dedication to uncovering the truth would ultimately cost him far more than his career. Crawford had built his reputation on meticulous investigation and an almost supernatural ability to uncover evidence that others missed. A tall, lean man with prematurely gray hair and penetrating dark eyes, he had solved some of Pittsburgh's most challenging cases through sheer persistence and an unwillingness to accept convenient explanations that didn't fit the facts. But the Vandermark case would test every skill he had developed over 2 decades of police work, presenting him with a mystery that seemed to defy logical explanation, while simultaneously revealing a conspiracy so vast and well-protected that even acknowledging its existence put his life in danger. Crawford's initial interviews with the household staff revealed several disturbing details that never made it into the official police report. Margaret Sullivan confided that in the weeks leading up to her disappearance, Evangeline had been receiving mysterious visitors, well-dressed men who arrived after dark and departed before dawn, entering through the mansion's service entrance to avoid being seen by neighbors or the main household staff. These meetings always took place in Evangeline's private study, and Margaret noted that after each visit, her mistress appeared increasingly agitated and fearful. The housekeeper's description of these nocturnal visitors was troubling in its specificity. They were always impeccably dressed in expensive suits and overcoats, spoke with educated accents that suggested upper-class backgrounds, and carried themselves with the confidence of men accustomed to wielding power. But what Margaret found most unsettling was their eyes. Cold, calculating gazes that seemed to take in every detail of their surroundings as if assessing potential threats or escape routes. More troubling still was Thomas Brennan's observation that someone had been regularly visiting the estate's old ice house, a stone structure built into the hillside behind the mansion. The ice house hadn't been used for its original purpose in years, as the Vandermarks had installed one of the city's first electric refrigeration systems in 1885. The structure itself was an impressive feat of engineering, built into the natural slope of the hill, with walls 3 feet thick and a complex system of drainage channels designed to keep the interior dry and cool year-round. Brennan had noticed fresh footprints in the snow leading to and from the ice house on multiple occasions throughout November and early December, always the prints of a woman's small boots that matched those found in Evangeline's closet. But more disturbing than the footprints themselves was their pattern. They suggested that someone had been making regular visits to the ice house, always at night and always alone. On several occasions, Thomas had seen a faint light glowing from within the structure, as if someone were using a lantern or candle to illuminate the interior. When Crawford attempted to question Thomas about these observations in detail, the groundskeeper revealed something even more unsettling. On at least 3 occasions, he had seen not just Evangeline's footprints leading to the ice house, but also the tracks of a much larger person, someone wearing heavy boots of the type typically worn by workmen or laborers. These larger footprints always appeared on the same nights as Evangeline's visits, but they followed a different path, approaching the ice house from the direction of the public road rather than from the mansion itself. Detective Crawford's attempts to search the ice house were blocked by Cornelius Vandermark himself, who claimed that the structure was unsafe and that a full structural inspection would be required before anyone could enter. This explanation struck Crawford as suspicious, given that the ice house had been built with the same attention to quality and durability that characterized all of the Vandermark estate's structures. When Crawford pressed for permission to conduct even a limited examination of the building's exterior, he was informed by Vandermark's lawyers that any investigation of the ice house would require a specific warrant that clearly articulated probable cause for believing evidence of a crime might be found within. The legal obstacles placed in Crawford's path were unlike anything he had encountered in his 2 decades of police work. Typically, families of missing persons were eager to cooperate with any investigation that might lead to their loved one's recovery. But the Vandermark case was different. From the very beginning, it seemed as if powerful forces were working to limit the scope of the investigation and prevent certain areas of inquiry from being pursued. When Crawford returned 3 days later with the necessary permits and warrants, he found that the ice house had been sealed with fresh mortar and Vandermark's lawyers argued that the detective's warrant was no longer valid due to substantial modifications to the structure. The speed with which this sealing had been accomplished was remarkable, requiring the work of skilled masons and a substantial quantity of building materials that must have been procured and transported to the estate within a matter of hours. Perhaps most significantly, Crawford discovered that Evangeline's private journal, the leather-bound book that servants had seen her writing in obsessively, was missing from her locked writing desk. The desk itself showed no signs of forced entry, and the only key was reportedly in Evangeline's possession when she disappeared. When questioned about the journal, Cornelius claimed to have no knowledge of such a book, despite Margaret Sullivan's sworn testimony that she had seen him reading from it on the morning of Evangeline's disappearance. The missing journal was particularly significant because several servants had described it as containing far more than typical personal reflections or social correspondence. Margaret Sullivan reported that Evangeline had been working on what appeared to be a systematic documentation of some kind, filling page after page with detailed notes, sketches, and what looked like business correspondence. The journal had been thick enough to contain several hundred pages, and Evangeline had been writing in it daily for at least 6 months before her disappearance. Crawford's investigation took on a new dimension when he began to explore Evangeline's background and family history. The Hartwell banking family, once prominent figures in New England society, had apparently suffered a series of financial disasters in recent years that had reduced them from wealth and influence to near poverty in less than 5 years. What made this decline particularly suspicious was its speed and the specific nature of the financial instruments that had caused their ruin. Evangeline's father, Harrison Hartwell, had died under mysterious circumstances in Boston in 1886. Officially ruled a suicide by hanging, though no note was ever found, and family friends insisted that he had shown no signs of depression or financial despair. The Boston Police Department's file on Harrison Hartwell's death was remarkably thin, containing little more than a brief report describing the discovery of his body in his banking office and a cursory statement from the coroner attributing his death to suicide while of unsound mind. But Crawford's investigation revealed details about Harrison Hartwell's death that had never been included in the official Boston police report. A source within the Boston banking community informed Crawford that Harrison had been working on exposing a complex fraud scheme involving the manipulation of steel industry investments in the weeks before his death. This scheme allegedly involved a consortium of Pittsburgh industrialists who were using inside information about planned industrial accidents to manipulate steel prices and acquire competitors' assets at drastically reduced values. Even more disturbing was the fate of Evangeline's younger brother, Edmund Hartwell. Family friends claimed he had traveled to California to seek his fortune in late 1886, shortly after his father's death, though no one could provide specific details about his departure or his current whereabouts. Edmund had been a promising young attorney who had recently graduated from Harvard Law School and had been working with his father on investigating the financial irregularities that may have contributed to the family's ruin. Crawford's attempts to trace Edmund Hartwell's movements after leaving Boston revealed a troubling pattern. Railroad records showed that a young man matching Edmund's description had purchased a ticket to Chicago in November 1886, but there was no record of him continuing on to California. Hotel registries in Chicago showed that someone using the name E. Harrison had stayed at several different establishments during the winter of 1886 to 1887, always paying in cash and never remaining in one place for more than a few days. The detectives' investigation into the Hartwell family's financial ruin revealed a complex web of manipulated investments, fraudulent loans, and coordinated attacks on their business interests that bore all the hallmarks of a systematic campaign of destruction. The timing of these financial attacks coincided almost perfectly with Cornelius Vandermark's courtship of Evangeline, suggesting that her marriage might have been as much about eliminating a potential threat as it was about gaining social legitimacy for Vandermark's industrial empire. But perhaps the most chilling discovery Crawford made during his investigation into the Hartwell family was a pattern of similar financial attacks, targeting other prominent families throughout New England and the mid-Atlantic states. In each case, the targeted families had either owned steel-related businesses, possessed information about steel industry practices, or had been involved in investigating labor conditions or industrial safety issues. And in each case, the family's destruction had been followed by the acquisition of their assets by companies that could be traced back to a small group of Pittsburgh industrialists. Crawford's private notes from this period reveal his growing realization that Evangeline Vandermark's disappearance was not an isolated incident, but rather the latest in a series of eliminations designed to protect a conspiracy that had been operating for at least a decade. His investigation had uncovered evidence of what appeared to be a secret organization of industrial leaders who had systematically murdered their way to dominance of America's steel industry, leaving behind a trail of convenient accidents, suicides, and disappearances that had never been connected by law enforcement agencies operating in different jurisdictions. The scope of this conspiracy was staggering in its ambition and ruthlessness. Crawford's research suggested that the Pittsburgh Circle, as he had begun calling the organization in his notes, had been responsible for the deaths of at least 37 people over the past 10 years, including business rivals, investigative journalists, labor organizers, and family members who had possessed dangerous knowledge about the group's activities. The methods employed ranged from staged industrial accidents and building fires to apparent suicides and mysterious disappearances that left no trace of the victims. 3 months after Evangeline's disappearance, Pittsburgh's industrial landscape was shaken by a series of unprecedented events that seemed, at first glance, unrelated to the Vandermark mystery. A massive explosion at the Consolidated Steel Works, a facility owned by Vandermark's primary competitor, industrialist Henry Rutherford, killed 17 workers and destroyed nearly half the factory. The explosion occurred at 3:17 a.m. on a bitter March morning when only a skeleton crew of maintenance workers should have been present. But investigators later discovered that several key engineers and foremen had been working late that night on what Rutherford described as critical production modifications. The official investigation blamed a faulty boiler, but whispers throughout Pittsburgh's working-class neighborhoods suggested sabotage. The pattern of destruction was unlike anything seen in previous industrial accidents, with the explosion appearing to have originated from multiple points simultaneously rather than from a single mechanical failure. More troubling still was the discovery that several of the factory's safety systems had been deliberately disabled in the hours before the explosion, though this information was quickly suppressed by both company officials and local authorities. What made this tragedy particularly relevant to Evangeline's case was a discovery made by one of the surviving workers, an Irish immigrant named Patrick O'Connell. O'Connell had been working as a night watchman at the Consolidated Steel Works for over 3 years, and his duties included regular patrols of the entire facility to check for signs of fire, intruders, or mechanical problems. On the night of the explosion, he had noticed several unusual details that he later reported to Detective Crawford in secret. While helping to clear debris from the explosion site, O'Connell found a partially burned leather satchel hidden beneath a collapsed section of the factory's office building. The satchel contained documents that appeared to detail the structural weaknesses of several Pittsburgh steel mills, including precise engineering drawings and what looked like schedules for planned accidents. Most shocking of all, the handwriting on several of these documents was distinctly feminine, written in the same elegant script that Margaret Sullivan recognized from Evangeline's correspondence. The documents in the satchel represented months or even years of careful study and preparation. They included detailed floor plans of multiple industrial facilities throughout Pittsburgh and the surrounding region, annotated with notes about security procedures, shift schedules, and optimal timing for various types of sabotage. Some of the plans were accompanied by photographs that appeared to have been taken covertly from within the facilities, showing specific equipment and structural elements that would later be identified as the sources of accidental explosions or fires. O'Connell, perhaps naively, brought these documents to Detective Crawford, who by this time had been quietly continuing his investigation into Evangeline's disappearance, despite official orders to close the case. The detectives examined